The terminal at Gate 14 hummed with the particular kind of white noise that belongs only to airports at 6 in the morning, that restless, pressurized energy of 1,000 people moving in 100 different directions, all of them convinced that wherever they were going mattered more than wherever anyone else was headed. Announcements drifted overhead in overlapping languages. Luggage wheels clattered across polished floors. Coffee lines stretched 20 people deep. A child in a yellow raincoat ran ahead of her parents through the corridor, dragging a stuffed rabbit by one ear, oblivious to the seriousness that every adult around her was performing with such earnest effort. The floors of the terminal were the same neutral gray that airports everywhere seemed to have agreed upon as the official color of transit, and the light from the overhead panels was the particular quality of artificial light that erases shadows and flattens everything into the same institutional brightness. A woman in a blazer hurried past with a phone pressed to one ear and a half-eaten yogurt in her other hand, conducting two things at once without completing either. A man in his 60s sat by a window with both hands around a paper coffee cup and his eyes closed, either asleep or meditating. Either way, occupying a stillness that stood out against the general motion, like a stone in a current. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a woman in a charcoal blazer moved through the crowd with the quiet, unhurried confidence of someone who had learned long ago that rushing was almost always someone else's problem. Her name was Ava Brooks. She was 39 years old. She carried a single leather tote bag, and no assistant, no entourage, no security detail. This was deliberate. Ava had built a habit over the years of traveling alone whenever possible, booking herself onto commercial flights under a name that meant nothing to most people, slipping through terminals just like this one, watching how real customers were treated, when no one knew who they were watching. She called it her field research. Her board of directors called it reckless. She called it necessary. The boarding pass in her hand was unremarkable in every way except one. It read, First Class, Seat 2A, printed cleanly beside her full name. She had purchased it 6 weeks in advance, routed through the airline's business portal, upgraded through the standard process. There was nothing unusual about it. It was a ticket. She had paid for it. She expected to sit in it. These were the kinds of expectations that, for most of the passengers moving through Gate 14 that morning, were so obvious they would never have occurred to anyone to mention. Ava had learned through years of experience that had nothing to do with airports, that the obvious was often the first thing to disappear. She had built her career on understanding systems, how they worked, how they failed, where the gaps between stated policy and actual practice tended to open up. She had learned to watch for those gaps, not with cynicism, but with the particular clear-eyed patience of someone who has diagnosed enough broken systems to know that diagnosis is always the first step toward repair. She carried that patience with her everywhere she went. It had served her well in boardrooms and government hearings and difficult negotiations in hotel conference rooms in 4 different countries. It would serve her today. She did not yet know exactly how, but she had been in enough rooms to know that patience, when combined with preparation and documentation, was rarely the weaker position. She joined the priority boarding line, which had perhaps 8 people ahead of her, all of them in business attire, all of them with the same slightly distracted, slightly self-important expression that seemed to be the unofficial uniform of the frequent business traveler. She checked her phone once, confirmed 2 calendar reminders, and then put it away. She did not scroll. She did not fidget. She simply waited, her boarding pass in her left hand, her bag strap settled over her right shoulder, her expression composed in that particular way. She had not cold, not warm, just present, watching everything, without appearing to watch anything at all. She noticed the gate agent process the first 3 passengers, without looking up from her terminal, working with the automatic rhythm of someone who had repeated the same sequence of gestures several thousand times. She noticed a man in 1B trying to negotiate a larger overhead bin space from his window position. She noticed the small logistics of how other human beings moved through structured space, the way they deferred or asserted, hesitated or strode, and she stored all of it in the part of her mind that was always underneath everything else, doing the work. This was why she traveled alone. Not because she had no one to travel with, not because solitude was her preference in any absolute sense, but because this observation of ordinary life, in ordinary spaces, was a form of research that no report or consultant could replicate for her. She wanted to see the experience the way her customers saw it. She wanted to know where it was broken, before someone's carefully edited quarterly summary told her it was fine. The line moved. She moved with it. She reached the boarding agent's podium, placed her boarding pass on the reader, and looked forward toward the jetway. The scanner beeped. The screen lit up green. She reached for her pass. Richard Collins stepped in front of her. He was 52, with the kind of posture that suggested a long career spent, believing himself indispensable, and the kind of eyes that had grown accustomed to categorizing people in the first 2 seconds of looking at them. He was the senior cabin manager for this flight, the man responsible for first class, and he had been doing this job for 19 years. He had developed, over those 19 years, a highly confident set of instincts about people. Those instincts were almost entirely wrong, and he had never once been required to examine them. He understood his domain as one of controlled order, of standards maintained and distinctions preserved, and he had long since made the category error of confusing the preservation of those distinctions with a form of professional excellence. He was not a cruel man in any deliberate sense. He did not wake up in the mornings and make decisions about how to treat people. He simply moved through his work with a set of assumptions so deeply embedded they had long stopped feeling like assumptions and had come to feel, instead, like perception. He looked at Ava. He looked at the boarding pass the scanner had just cleared. He looked at Ava again. Something in his expression rearranged itself into a shape that was not quite accusation, but was not quite anything else either. "Is this your ticket?" he asked. His voice was polite in the way that knives are polite, technically smooth, but carrying an edge underneath. Ava met his gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said. One word. Perfectly level. Richard looked at the pass again, then back at her. "And this is your name on the ticket? This is your reservation?" Ava said. "It is." Behind her, a man in a gray suit shifted his weight. Someone else exhaled through their nose. The priority line had come to a standstill. Richard did not seem to notice, or did not care. He asked her to step aside while he verified the booking. He asked for a second form of identification, even though the scanner had already cleared her boarding pass. Even though no one in the 8 people ahead of her had been asked for anything beyond the pass itself. She produced her driver's license. He studied it for a long moment. She watched him do it without a change in her expression. He asked if she had a confirmation email. She showed him her phone. He read it twice. Around them, the terminal continued its noise, but at the mouth of the jetway, a small knot of attention had begun to form, other passengers watching. A second gate agent glancing over uncertainly. A young couple exchanging a look that said what they would not say out loud. Richard handed back her phone and her license and her boarding pass. Then he said the thing that he had apparently decided, somewhere in the last 4 minutes, that he was entitled to say. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This seat has been reassigned. You'll need to proceed to economy class." Ava looked at him. She did not raise her voice. She did not move. She simply said, very quietly, "There is no reassignment notice on my boarding pass." The scanner cleared it. "On what basis are you making this request?" Richard said, "Please don't make this difficult." He said it the way people say things when they believe the difficulty is being caused by the other person and not by themselves. An older white businessman, 2 people back in line, said, clearly enough to be heard, "She has a ticket. She just scanned through." Richard turned and gave him a look that suggested his input had not been requested. Another passenger, a man in a window seat across the jetway threshold who had paused to watch, laughed quietly and said something to his companion that neither of them repeated loud enough to catch, but the tone of it was not kind. Melissa Grant, the primary cabin attendant for the first-class section, had come to the boarding door to see what was causing the delay. She stood just beyond the threshold, watching. She felt something uncomfortable settle in the back of her chest, something she could not name quickly enough to act on. She watched Richard continue to hold his position. She watched the woman in the charcoal blazer stand, with a patience that seemed less like submission and more like something being carefully calculated. Ava looked at Richard for one long moment. Then she said, "I'll cooperate." She took her boarding pass and her bag, and she stepped out of the priority line. She walked to a row of seats near the window. She sat down. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry or plead or demand to speak to someone's manager. She set her bag on the floor, opened her laptop, and began to work. Richard watched her go with the satisfied expression of a man who had just solved a problem. He had not solved anything. He had just started a clock. 28 minutes. That was how long it took. Later, people would pick apart those 28 minutes the way investigators pick apart a flight recorder, searching for the exact moment when one thing became another, when a small and ordinary cruelty became something that could not be contained or managed or quietly papered over. But in those first few minutes, sitting in the plastic chair near the window with the morning sun cutting a pale line across her laptop screen, Ava Brooks looked like nothing more than a businesswoman who had been inconvenienced. She pulled up her email. She typed 3 messages, each of them short, each of them precise. The first went to her chief technology officer with 2 attachments, a screenshot of her boarding confirmation and a note that read, "Documentation needed by 8 a.m. The second went to her head of contract management and contained 4 words, "Do not reschedule Thursday." The third went to Olivia Chen and contained no words at all, just a location pin for gate 14 and a timestamp. She did not explain what had happened in the body of any email because she did not need to. The people she was writing to already knew what to look for. She sent them. She closed her email. She opened a second application and made a phone call that lasted 45 seconds. The voice on the other end belonged to Olivia Chen, Ava's chief legal counsel, who had been in practice for 17 years and had the particular quality of mind that could hear the shape of a situation from 3 words. Olivia said, "What do you need?" Ava said, "Everything that happened in the last 15 minutes is going to be on camera. Gate 14, the boarding area, the jetway threshold. I want the footage preserved before the flight pushes back." There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Olivia said, "Confirmed?" Ava said, "All of it." Olivia said, "Understood." The call ended. Ava set her phone face down on her knee. She looked out the window at the plane sitting at the gate. She looked at her watch. She did not look angry. She did not look upset. She looked like someone who had just set something into motion and was now waiting for it to arrive. Inside the cabin, Richard Collins moved through the first-class section with the unhurried authority of a man in his element. He straightened the linen on seat 2A. He exchanged pleasantries with a couple in row 3, who were flying for their anniversary. He accepted a compliment on his efficiency from a passenger in 1B. He did not think about the woman in the charcoal blazer. He had made a decision, and the decision had been accepted, and that was the end of it as far as he was concerned. There was a particular kind of confidence that lived in him, not the confidence of a man who examined his choices and found them sound, but the confidence of a man who had never been made to examine them at all. It was a confidence built on the foundation of being right in all the ways that had ever mattered, in all the rooms where his rightness had ever been tested, and it was, for this reason, both completely real and completely fragile, the way things are when they have never been properly stress-tested. He moved through the cabin. He checked the galley supplies. He reviewed the meal manifest. He did not look out toward the waiting area where a woman in a charcoal blazer had opened her laptop and begun, with focused and unhurried attention, to set something in motion. Melissa, straightening headphones sets in the overhead compartment 2 rows back, found herself glancing toward the boarding door. She was not sure why. The discomfort from earlier had not gone away. If anything, it had settled deeper, the way certain kinds of cold do when you stop moving. She went over the exchange in her mind. The scanner had cleared the pass. She had seen the green light from the doorway. The woman had produced every document asked of her, had done so without protest, had complied with every instruction. And still, something about the way Richard had handled it felt wrong in a way that Melissa did not yet have the vocabulary to fully describe, though she would find it later. She went back to straightening the headphone sets. At the gate desk, the second boarding agent had resumed processing the remaining passengers, though she kept glancing toward the window seat where the woman was still working. The older businessman who had spoken up had boarded, shooting a last look over his shoulder as he went. The couple who had exchanged looks had boarded. The gate thinned out. The door to the jetway had almost swung closed. The clock behind the gate desk read 6:47. Boarding was nearly complete. The captain had signaled that the aircraft was ready to push back on schedule. In 14 minutes, the door would be sealed. The gate agent was running through her final checklist, the sequence of confirmations and closures that marked the narrow formal boundary between a flight preparing to leave and a flight that had left. Outside the window, the ground crew had moved into their positions. The jet bridge was locked. The belly hatch was sealed. Everything had the appearance, from the inside of that terminal, of an ordinary morning proceeding at its ordinary pace. In the plastic chair near the window, Ava closed her laptop and folded her hands on top of it. She was not watching the gate anymore. She was watching the runway in the pale morning light. She looked, if anything, calm. She looked like someone who had done what needed doing and was content to let events unfold at their own speed. The gate agent began to shut down her terminal. The last few passengers filed through. The door swung nearly closed. The captain's phone rang. He answered it on the second ring with the automatic efficiency of someone accustomed to calls at every stage of a flight. The voice on the other end was not from the tower. It was from the airline's operations center, and it used a code designation that the captain had heard exactly twice in his career, both times in training simulations, never in an actual flight. The code meant, "Do not push back." It meant, "Wait for further instruction." It meant that something had been escalated to a level above his direct authority, and he was to stand by. He set the phone down. He looked at his co-pilot. His co-pilot looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The silence in the cockpit had a specific texture, not alarm, exactly, but heightened alertness, the feeling of a situation whose full dimensions were not yet visible. The captain had spent 31 years in commercial aviation. He had managed diversions and mechanical holds and weather delays, and one medical emergency at 35,000 feet that had required landing at an unscheduled airport in the middle of the night. He understood, from the code and from the tone of the voice that had delivered it, that whatever was being managed on the ground below him was not a routine matter. He did not speculate further. He picked up the intercom and notified the cabin crew to hold all boarding completion procedures. Melissa, who had been counting meal trays in the galley, went still. Richard, who was adjusting the window shade in row 2, turned around. The plane was silent in the way that planes are almost never silent. It was the silence of something stopped that was supposed to be moving. Daniel Foster received the call in the airline's regional operations office at 6:49 in the morning, which meant someone had moved very fast. He was the regional executive director for the carrier's Eastern hub, a man who had spent 23 years managing the operational and reputational infrastructure of a major airline, a man who believed in protocols and chains of command, and the careful, systematic management of anything that could become a crisis before it became a public one. He understood that crises were almost never the events themselves. They were the responses. An airline could survive a delay. It could not survive a response to a delay that looked indifferent, defensive, or small. He had built his career on understanding that distinction, and he had spent 2 decades trying to build an organization that understood it too. He listened to the summary he was given. He asked 2 questions. He asked for the name of the passenger who had been denied boarding in first class. When he heard the answer, he went quiet for a moment, in a way that was different from his usual, deliberate quiet. He said, "I'm going there now." He left his office. He did not wait for his assistant. He did not take his jacket from the back of his chair. He walked directly to the elevator and pressed the button for the terminal level, and his face, in the mirrored elevator doors, had the expression of a man doing the rapid mental arithmetic of a very large and very complicated problem. He reached gate 14 at 6:53. Richard Collins was standing near the boarding door with the contained, defensive posture of a man who has been told to wait but has not yet been told why. Daniel approached him. He said, without preamble, there is a passenger who was redirected from first class on this flight. A Miss Ava Brooks. Where is she now? Richard's expression did not change immediately. It changed in stages, the way structures change under slow, increasing pressure, first barely perceptibly, then all at once. He said, she's in the waiting area. It was a routine issue with the seating configuration, Daniel said. I need you to stop talking. He said it quietly. Richard stopped talking. Daniel turned to the gate agent and asked where Miss Brooks was seated. The agent pointed to the row of chairs near the window. Daniel walked there without looking back. He arrived at the chair. He looked at the woman in the charcoal blazer, who looked up from her laptop with an expression of polite attention. Daniel said, Miss Brooks, I am Daniel Foster, Regional Executive Director. I am deeply sorry for what happened this morning. On behalf of this airline, I apologize without reservation. Ava looked at him for a moment. She said, Thank you, Mr. Foster. She said it the way people say thank you when they are receiving something that should never have needed to be given. Richard Collins, watching from 20 feet away, had the experience for the first time of not understanding what he was seeing. He watched Daniel Foster, a man Richard had met once at a regional staff meeting, and who had the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making very large decisions, standing in front of a passenger in economy holding, speaking with the body language of someone who had just arrived at a scene and found it worse than reported. And then the other people began to arrive. A woman in a dark suit with a leather attaché case, who turned out to be Ava's attorney, Olivia Chen, already on site because she had apparently been in the city on other business. A representative from the airport's operations management. 2 additional executives from the airline's corporate structure who had been reached in sequence over the previous 20 minutes, and who had each, in turn, made the same rapid calculation that Daniel had made and arrived at the same destination. They gathered near the window seats. They spoke to Ava with the attentive deference of people who understood precisely what they were standing in the presence of, even if that understanding had arrived somewhat too late. Richard watched this assembly with the sensation of watching a building go up around a space he had thought was empty. Every face that arrived added another wall. He was still constructing his explanation, still composing, somewhere in the back of his mind, the version of the morning's events that would make sense of his decisions, but the explanation kept losing its shape against the reality of what was gathering in front of him. He did not yet know what he was looking at. He knew that it was serious. He knew that serious was not a category he had assigned to this situation when the situation had begun. Melissa had come to the boarding doorway and was watching. She took out her phone. She typed the name Ava Brooks into a search engine. She waited 2 seconds. The results populated. She read the first 3 headlines. She felt the blood leave her face in a single, swift, vertiginous movement. Forbes had named Ava Brooks to its list of the 100 most powerful women in business, 3 years running. CNBC had profiled her 18 months ago under the headline, The Quiet Architect. Fortune had run her on a cover with the subtitle, The CEO Who Rebuilds Everything She Touches. She was the founder and chief executive of NovaBridge Technologies, a firm that had grown from a 4-person startup in a converted warehouse in Atlanta to a global company with operations in 31 countries, and a valuation that had crossed $40 billion the previous fiscal year. Richard Collins, who had still not moved from his position near the boarding door, watched all of this from a distance, with the dawning comprehension of a man who has been standing in the wrong place for a very long time and is only now beginning to understand the coordinates. He did not yet fully grasp the architecture of what was surrounding him, but he was beginning to feel its shape the way you feel a room getting smaller before you can see the walls moving. He watched his regional director bend slightly at the waist as he spoke to the woman he had removed from a first-class seat an hour ago. He watched lawyers open briefcases. He watched senior executives check their phones and then check them again. He watched Melissa read something on her phone and then look at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. He understood, somewhere in the cold and clarifying place that lives beneath all self-justification, that he had made an error of a kind that was not going to be corrected by an apology at the gate. What Richard could not yet see, what none of the passengers who had witnessed the exchange at the boarding podium could see, what even Daniel Foster was still in the process of assembling from the briefings arriving on his phone, was the full dimension of what Ava's company meant to this airline. Novabridge Technologies was not merely a client. It was a partner in the deepest operational sense of the word. 3 years prior, the airline had entered into a strategic technology agreement with Novabridge to implement an AI-driven logistics management system across its entire North American cargo and scheduling infrastructure. The system managed route optimization, predictive maintenance flagging, crew scheduling, and real-time operational load balancing. It had reduced the airline's operational delays by 19% in the first 18 months of deployment. It had saved the company an estimated $230 million in the preceding fiscal year alone. The contract that governed this partnership was up for renewal in 11 days. The meeting at which that renewal would be discussed, the meeting that would determine whether Novabridge extended the agreement, expanded it, or chose not to renew at all, was the meeting Ava Brooks was flying to attend. She was not flying to this city to give a presentation to the airline. She was flying to chair the meeting herself, as the decision-maker on her own side of the table. The 3 emails she had sent from the plastic chair near the window had gone to her chief technology officer, her head of contract management, and her executive assistant. None of them had contained the word lawsuit. All of them had contained the phrase documentation confirmed. Daniel Foster understood, by the time he finished reading the briefing on his phone, that the woman who had been removed from Seat 2A that morning was, in a very direct and immediate sense, one of the most important people his company was going to encounter that week. He also understood that the next 11 days were going to require a level of careful, sustained, genuine accountability that went far beyond anything a regional executive could manage alone. The footage request Olivia Chen submitted was formal, specific, and covered 4 separate camera systems. It included the general boarding area camera nearest Gate 14, which had captured Ava's approach to the boarding podium and the entirety of the interaction with Richard. It included the jetway threshold camera, which had captured the moment Richard had physically redirected her away from the door. It included the interior gate camera, which had captured both the initial scan and subsequent verification requests, as well as the expressions and reactions of several other passengers. It included the audio capture from the gate agent's podium microphone, which was a standard component of the boarding management system, and which had been recording the entire exchange at a distance of approximately 4 feet. The airline's legal team received the preservation request at 7:15 in the morning and did not attempt to delay compliance, partly because delay would have been inadvisable, and partly because Daniel Foster had already instructed them to cooperate fully before the request arrived. The footage was reviewed in sequence by the airline's internal review team, by Olivia Chen's office, and by the airport's own compliance division. What it showed was not ambiguous. Richard's first request for additional documentation came 17 seconds after the scanner had cleared the boarding pass, before he had spoken a word to Ava, before any issue with the ticket had been raised, based on no visible technical problem with the pass itself. His subsequent requests for identification and booking confirmation were not matched by any parallel request to the 8 passengers who had preceded Ava through the same boarding gate using the same scanning system. His statement to Ava that the seat had been reassigned was not supported by any corresponding entry in the flight's seat management record, which showed Seat 2A as assigned to Ava Brooks at the time of boarding and unmodified throughout the boarding process. 2 other statements he made during the exchange, caught clearly on the podium audio, were flagged by the review team as warranting specific attention. Melissa Grant gave her account voluntarily before she was asked. She requested a meeting with the airline's compliance officer within 2 hours of the incident and spent 40 minutes providing a precise, detailed, chronological account of everything she had observed. She described the moment the scanner cleared the boarding pass. She described the expressions on Richard's face. She described what she had felt standing in the doorway and not acting on it, and she described this last part with a kind of rigorous honesty that the compliance officer would later note in her written summary as unusually forthcoming. The older businessman who had spoken up at the gate provided a written statement through his own travel management service, which his assistant filed before his connecting flight departed. The couple who had exchanged looks were reached by the compliance team by phone that afternoon and confirmed independently what they had seen. The man who had made the quiet comment to his companion was identified from the boarding records but declined to provide a statement, which told its own story without requiring elaboration. The record, when assembled, was comprehensive. It left very little room for the kind of ambiguity that allows difficult situations to be managed quietly and made to disappear. In the 3 days following the incident, the people around Ava Brooks repeatedly made the same mistake. They assumed they understood what she wanted. They assumed she wanted what people in her position usually want: compensation, public acknowledgement, punitive consequences visited on the individual who had wronged her. They assumed that a woman of her resources and her standing would want the machinery of accountability to grind in the direction of the person who had caused her the most direct and personal harm. They were not wrong that she wanted accountability. They were wrong about what she thought accountability meant. Olivia Chen had already filed the formal discrimination complaint with the appropriate regulatory bodies, and that process would proceed on its own timeline, regardless of what Ava said in any room. But when Daniel Foster requested a formal meeting, a real one, not a press-prepared apology, Ava agreed to attend. She arrived without legal counsel, which surprised people. She sat at the table in the airline's regional conference room, and she looked at the 7 people assembled across from her, and when Daniel invited her to speak first, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't need the seat." She let that sit for a moment. Several people shifted in their chairs. She said, "What I want to understand is how your system made this possible. Not one person's decision. The system. The culture that told a senior employee that his read of a person was more reliable than the documentation in front of him. The training, or the absence of training, that left him with no mechanism to catch himself. The structure that allowed something that is obviously wrong to feel, to him, like a normal operating decision." The room was very quiet. She said, "If I had been any of the 260 other passengers on that flight today, if I had no public profile, no lawyers, no relationship with your organization, would this conversation be happening?" No one answered. She said, "That's not a rhetorical question." Still no one answered, but the silence had changed quality, the way silence does when people are not avoiding a question but confronting it. She said, "That's the answer." She picked up her water glass, took a sip, and set it back down with the quiet precision of someone who had made her point and was finished making it. The airline's emergency board response took shape over the following 72 hours. The decisions made in those 3 days were more extensive than anything the airline's external communications team had initially drafted into the crisis response framework. Richard Collins was suspended immediately pending a full investigation, which was not a surprise. What was less expected was the scope of what followed. The airline's CEO authorized a full audit of the boarding procedures across all major hubs, specifically examining patterns of differential treatment during the boarding and upgrade process. The audit would be conducted by an independent third-party firm, with no prior relationship to the carrier. The airline commissioned a mandatory retraining program for all customer-facing staff, to be developed in consultation with civil rights organizations and behavioral researchers, focused specifically on implicit bias, decision-making under low-stakes perceived authority, and the gap between subjective instinct and documented fact. A dedicated complaint escalation pathway was established, designed so that any passenger who felt they had been improperly handled during boarding could reach a senior manager within 4 minutes, not a gate agent, not a supervisor in the back office, but a manager with the actual authority to intervene. An independent oversight committee was formed, composed of external members with backgrounds in civil rights law, consumer advocacy, and airline operations, to review escalated complaints on a quarterly basis and report directly to the board. The public apology was issued not as a press release, but in the format of a direct letter to all frequent flyers, signed by the CEO, describing what had happened, what the company had failed to do, and what it intended to change. It was not short. It was not written in the passive voice. It used the word wrong 4 times. Melissa Grant was not disciplined. The compliance officer's report noted that her voluntary and detailed disclosure had been a material factor in the completeness of the record, and that her decision to speak truthfully, rather than protectively, was precisely the kind of behavior the airline needed to cultivate, rather than discourage. She completed the first iteration of the new training program 2 weeks after the incident. The following month, she was asked to help facilitate the program's pilot session for a group of 30 new cabin crew members. She accepted. Ava Brooks went to her meeting. It had been rescheduled by 2 days, accommodating the disruption to her travel plans, and she arrived with the same leather tote bag, and the same charcoal blazer, and the same unhurried composure she had carried through Gate 14 on that early morning. The meeting lasted 6 hours across 2 consecutive days, with the kind of pauses and recesses and sidebar conversations that large and complicated agreements require when both sides are trying to build something that will last longer than the document itself. Ava's team had prepared thoroughly. They had prepared, it became clear, for every likely objection and several unlikely ones, and they moved through the technical review and the operational performance data and the implementation roadmap for the proposed expansion with the precision of a group of people who had spent a great deal of time making sure that the work spoke clearly on its own behalf. The renewal discussions were complex, as all discussions involving several $billion and multi-year operational dependencies tend to be. They reached an agreement on day 2. The terms were, by most measures, more favorable to Novabridge than the previous contract had been. No one in the room made any reference to what had happened at the airport. The work was the work. It had always been the work. Whatever else had happened, and whatever else was still in the process of being resolved through regulatory and legal channels, the work continued because serious people had built something that mattered and were committed to what they had built. That was true of Ava. It was true of the people across the table from her. It is, in the end, almost always what is true of the people who build things that last. The press conference happened 8 days after the incident, organized not at the airline's request, but through a mutual agreement between the airline's communications office and Ava's team. It was held in a mid-sized conference room at a hotel near the airport, and it was attended by reporters from 8 outlets, 4 of whom had been covering the story since it broke 3 days after the incident, through a brief and factual statement from Olivia Chen's office. The airline CEO spoke first. He read a prepared statement that had been through 11 revisions, and the final version was the shortest one. He described what had happened. He described the airline's responsibility. He used the word discrimination without qualification and without the softening phrase alleged. He outlined the changes the company was implementing. He did not attempt to explain Richard Collins's decision-making because he had been advised. Correctly, that explanation at this stage would read as mitigation, and mitigation was not the moment's requirement. Then Ava spoke. She was not on the original program. She had asked to be included 3 days earlier, and the airline had agreed without hesitation. She spoke without notes. She did not mention the seat. She did not describe the specifics of what had been said to her at Gate 14, because the record spoke to those specifics more clearly than any retelling could. She spoke about something else. She said, "I've been asked many times this week whether I felt powerful in that moment. And the honest answer is no. In that moment, standing at a boarding gate with a valid ticket and being told that the seat I had purchased was not for someone like me, I did not feel powerful. I felt exactly what anyone would feel. I felt the specific quality of being reduced, the particular experience of having your documentation examined more carefully than your face deserves, of having your word doubted more readily than your paperwork, of being placed in the category of person who needs to be managed rather than served." She paused. A few seconds of silence passed, which is a long time in a room full of reporters. What I want people to understand is that I was able to make phone calls. I was able to engage legal counsel. I was able to sit in that plastic chair and type 3 emails, and know, with complete confidence, that the emails would produce a result. Most people cannot do that. Most people who have that experience at that gate walk away from it carrying something they never asked to carry, with no mechanism to set it down. They carry it onto the next flight and the one after that, and into every room where they are asked to produce one more piece of documentation than the person before them. She looked across the room. Her voice did not waver. The question that matters, the only question that really matters, is what happens to the person who doesn't have my phone contacts. The person whose name doesn't appear in a business publication. The person who walks away from gate 14 at 6 in the morning with no recourse and no record and no one coming to find them in the waiting area with an apology. The room was very still. If the answer to that question is nothing, then we still have a great deal of work to do. When she finished, there was a moment before the applause began. The kind of moment that happens when something has been said that requires a breath before it can be responded to. The cameras at the press conference caught Melissa Grant seated in the third row, in civilian clothes, attending on her day off. Her expression was not easy to categorize it, held something that was not quite grief and not quite resolve, but lived in the narrow space between them, the expression of someone who is in the process of understanding something about themselves that they cannot yet entirely account for and has decided to lean into the understanding rather than away from it. She had thought about not coming. She had stood in her kitchen that morning at 6:45, almost exactly the same time she had stood in the doorway of the jetway 2 weeks before, watching something wrong happen and not moving, and she had thought about all the reasons not to go. It would be noticed. People might ask questions. It might be seen as an attempt to insert herself into a story that was not hers to insert herself into. She had turned all of these thoughts over, examined each one, and recognized each one for what it was, which was an excuse in the shape of a consideration. She went anyway. After the event, she approached Ava briefly in the corridor, when most of the press had dispersed. She said, "I'm sorry. I know that word isn't enough. I just need to say it." Ava looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I know." She said, "What you did, the account you gave, the honesty you chose, that is what change looks like from the inside. Most people don't choose that. You did." Melissa nodded. She did not say anything else. Some things don't need more words. Some things need only to be witnessed. She would go on to complete the first round of the airline's new training program, and then the second, and then she would be asked to help lead the pilot session for new crew members, and she would say yes, not because it was required of her, or because it erased what she had failed to do in the doorway of the jetway on that early morning, but because accountability, she had learned, was not a single act, but a continuing direction. You pointed yourself toward it, and you kept moving. 3 weeks later, Ava was at a different airport. Same leather tote bag, same charcoal blazer, same posture of quiet attention as she moved through the priority boarding line, watching the other passengers, observing the small mechanics of how a system treats the people it is supposed to serve. She noticed the way the gate agent made eye contact with each person in sequence, neither rushing nor delaying, giving each interaction exactly as much time as it required. She noticed the way the boarding area had a clearly posted escalation notice, a new one, with a phone number and a response time commitment that had not been there 3 weeks ago. She noticed these things not with triumph, but with the same careful attention she brought to every system she observed, noting what had changed and wondering what still needed to. She handed over her boarding pass. The attendant scanned it. The screen lit green. The attendant looked up and smiled, not the careful, slightly nervous smile of someone who has been briefed, not the effortful smile of someone performing good service under observation, just the ordinary, uncomplicated smile of someone doing their job and meaning it. She said, "Welcome aboard, Miss Brooks." Ava smiled back. It was a small smile, the kind that costs nothing and means everything, the kind that belongs to a moment when what should be ordinary actually is. She walked down the jetway into the bright tunnel of the morning. She found her seat. She settled in. She opened her laptop. Outside the window, the tarmac stretched away into the pale early light, and somewhere behind her, the door of the aircraft closed with its clean, definitive sound, and the engines built toward their low and steady roar, and the plane began to move, not because she was a CEO, not because she was powerful, not because her name appeared in magazines, or because billions of dollars were tied to her signature, but because she was a passenger, because she had a ticket, because she had always had a ticket. And because this time, this ordinary, unremarkable, perfectly sufficient time, that was enough. It had always been enough. The work, from here, was making sure the world caught up to that fact.